Yeah.
Hey, hello, can you hear
Shall I
me?
go ahead? Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you too. So can you see the audience?
No, I see 648 and then some Chinese letters.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Okay. So
Sorry.
before we begin the talk, the several students will introduce you to the audience. So I will give the mic.
Okay. And
to-
shall I share my slides?
Yeah, you can show your slides first.
Let me just share them just a second. Okay, there we are. Just to see whether you can see them, just to be on the safe side. And sorry for being late. I really thought it was tomorrow evening. Yeah. Can you see the slides?
Okay. We can see the slides.
Yeah, okay.
So so let's begin the talk. Okay.
Okay, so let me know when I shall start talking.
Yeah. The talk. You can begin the talk.
Okay. Okay, I can go on. Okay, thank
Yeah.
you. Okay, thank you very much. I'm really sorry that I'm so late. I mixed up the date. So I talked to you about something very human, which has, namely consciousness, which has a lot of implications also for artificial intelligence. And in the current neuroscience and philosophy, we have a certain view of consciousness. And I say that maybe the empirical data suggest a different view. And there are three main errors which I identify that really block our view on what it really is. And that also blocks our view on judging whether current AI has consciousness. So first, of course, what do I mean by consciousness? Consciousness is a wide term. So what I mean by consciousness here is subjective experience. For instance, you listen to me and you have a feeling of boredom. That feeling of boredom is your consciousness, meaning what it is like to listen to an author. So maybe AI could listen in exactly the same way to me, but without experiencing anything. There could be no what it is like, no experience, or no feeling of boredom. So, and that is the question, how can we answer this question based on what kind of criteria, whether AI has a certain conscious experience? So, in a nutshell, what I mean by consciousness is a subjective experience, what it is like, a feeling. So, and I identify three errors of consciousness. First, that often, particularly in the Western world, we assume that consciousness is in the mind or in the brain or in the body, that it is located, that there's a certain point in time and space where we can say here and there is consciousness. That's what I call the localization or location problem. Second, that we assume that conscious content, for instance, your thoughts now, or your perception of me on Zoom, that this is a mental feature. And that because we cannot observe it, let's say if I were doing a brain scan of you, I could not observe your perceptual content, me being in Zoom, or your thought content that you're bored and think about some good, nice Chinese food. And that has philosophers and neuroscientists alike, that conscious contents are mental and non-physical. That ultimately what leads to what often in philosophy these days is described as a heart problem. Why and how are there mental states? But that for me is an error, and I will tell you why the characterization of the consciousness as mental. Second, a third error, that consciousness is special. It's different from anything else in the natural world and therefore special. That's why philosophers in the Western world have assumed mental properties, a spirit, a soul, a mind, you name it. And that read, probably you have heard about it, to the mind-body problem. So now I will say that specialness is probably an error. So now my talk is about basically deflating some of these errors and say that these are errors and they're not compatible with how we experience and how our brain works. And then I will formulate alternatives, and in each of these, I will basically say how that relates to AI, whether AI has consciousness or not. So I start with the localization of consciousness. I think I already showed that consciousness is either inside the mind or your brain or your body. You have different theories in the Western philosophy and also neuroscience. The embodiment people say it's a body, the brain people say it's a brain. There's a whole different series, neuroscientific series of consciousness, integrated information theory, you might have heard, global neuronal workspace theory, and I will later say our own temporal spatial theory of consciousness. So all these different theories, despite different approaches, presuppose that consciousness can be located. It can be located in an entity called brain. It can be located in an entity called body, or it can be located in an entity called mind. So, and here I already indicate there's a long history of different locations of consciousness in history. Here I take mainly a Western approach. Here you can see consciousness in the mind. The mind, then interestingly, in the 16th century, 15th century, consciousness has also been related to the heart. It hasn't been always related to the brain. There were long times where it's been correlated with the heart. The heart is the seat of the soul. Then it became the brain. And this is famous these days, the neural correlate of consciousness. And then there's also the embodiment. It's related to the body. The body, the brain is part of the body and the body as a whole. And now, of course, we're asking, does artificial consciousness has artificial intelligence as consciousness? So where is conscious located? And I say the question itself is problematic because that presupposes that consciousness can be located somewhere. However, and that basically means, okay, you have certain discrete points in time and space, and there is a context-independent entity. But that's a very narrow meaning of localization, as I will point out. But now, let's say, do we really experience consciousness at specific time, space points as a context-independent entity? No. Consciousness is not located at one particular point. It's continuously there. We never experience a particular activity or a particular region in our brain at a particular time space in our consciousness. Instead, we experience, let's say, perception content. For instance, you now perceive my hand moving, but even that, even if my hand is standing still, you perceive other contents in your consciousness. So it's continuously moving. It cannot be say, okay, it's only this point and that space. We cannot say that. And also, even if you now perceive me here via Zoom, you still perceive me as part of a context. Let's say, if the context were not the hall in which you're sitting, but a very tiny little room, and you still would have the same screen, you would experience me in a different way. Same content, I'm the same content for your conscious, but the context is very different. So your conscious contents are not content independent, context independent. They can be loaded. Even ourselves, we always experience ourselves in relation to others. I don't need to tell you, in the Chinese tradition, you have a long history of that, going back to Confucius and others, that you perceive and determine and define your sense of self in relation to other people and the society. And also our body, we experience our body here on the right also in relation to the respective context. So we integrate ourselves in our experience always as part of the wider world. So, and then of course you said that, let's say, intermittent conclusion, that means conclusion and not confusion. Consciousness is neither located in brain and body. We experience ourselves in this body and all the contents of our consciousness always as part of the wider world as a whole. There's always a context. Your context is now the room in which you're sitting. You perceive me via the Zoom in the big room in which you're sitting in the lecture. And then, of course, you might ask the question, where and how is such integration of ourself and its body within the world coming from? So this is a moment where the brain comes in. So then you can ask the question, yeah, and then how is it possible that I perceive myself sitting here in this lecture hall, relation to my neighbors, and as part of the lecture hall as a whole? So the only way for that to be possible is that somehow your brain connects to your neighbors and also processes the whole lecture hall as a whole. So somehow the brain must align itself very actively to the context in which you're sitting. So in the question, how is that possible? And that really leads to a specific feature of the brain. And now I show you some empirical data on this, which is often neglected because we only look at usually the cognition of the brain, the higher order cognition, but we don't look what happens prior to that. What happens, how the brain aligns continuously in a very adaptive way to its context. For that, I want to introduce a little bit of what is called dynamics. Dynamics here, you can see already the pattern of changes over time. Let's say you go to a river and you see continuously changing stream of water, or you go to the seaside, obviously not far from Gwangju. You see the waves, and that's a typical dynamics. And that's, you see what I also plotted here, the waves, and you see continuously changing pattern. So these are pattern of changes over time. This is, of course, clearly the seaside. These are typical seismic earth waves. Before you have an earthquake, you can have a lot of waves with regular or irregular pattern. And this is, for instance, a time series from the brain. So the brain has also dynamics, pattern of changes. And here I identify that concretely. So this is a time series that you can extract with either functional magnetic resonance imaging or electroencephalography. So here you see and these are different waves, different frequencies on different frequencies, which you can see here. The very slower frequency, about 100-second intervals. Here, faster frequency, we call them in different names, which I spare you. But this means it's like exactly like when you go out there to the seaside from Gwangju and you see the big waves, you see small waves. The big waves are usually slower and much more powerful. The smaller waves are faster and less. Yeah, and exactly the same, the brain has its own inner wave, its own inner dynamics. And that is key. Now you may ask the question, why on earth does the brain have all these waves? What on earth does the brain do with these waves? Yeah, and this is one of the answers. So the brain seems to use its own waves in the different frequencies, in the different speeds, fast, slow, longer, shorter time scales, to adapt to corresponding waves in the environment. So here I show you a very nice example from a study. Here we presented emotional phases. You can see this here, or control stimuli every 20 seconds. Now, and what we saw in the brain, that at every 20 seconds, so there's this rhythm, every 20 seconds, and exactly that frequency of the 20 seconds, this is 0.025 hertz, we saw an increase in the power spectrum of the, so you can measure that. This is a power spectrum, this is at different frequencies. This also includes the frequencies here of the every 20 seconds. And here is the degree of power. And you can see, then you can measure in the resting state without any phases. You see the typical slower frequencies have more power, faster frequencies have less power. But now look what happens when you present these phases every 20 seconds. You suddenly see an increase in exactly the frequency range in which the phases were presented. And this is called the phase area in the brain, called the fusiform phase area. So it's amazing. So your brain tracks exactly the timing of these stimuli. If I had presented these stimuli every 10 seconds, your bump here, your increase would have been here, in exactly the same frequency in which the stimuli were presented. So the brain uses its own repertoire of different waves to align and to adapt to corresponding waves in the brain. and it's in the environment and also in the body. This is really amazing. The brain is very, very sensitive to that. It continuously, and this is out of your voluntary control. You have no control. It's completely unconscious. The brain does a job for you. It's completely automatic. It's amazing. Now I show you now what happens when you lose consciousness. So here again, we present it here. You see the big blue bar. Here it's exactly this frequency in which we presented external stimuli. Yeah, and your brain, as always, tracks them down very well. And I can guarantee you, if I were continuing this a couple of minutes here, your brain would show an increase in its power spectrum and exactly the frequency I'm moving. It's amazing. And you cannot control this. You have no control over it. You cannot say, brain, you don't do this. I don't want to follow North's head. No way. Your brain does it for you. Yeah. Now, when you lose consciousness, like when you are anesthetic, when you undergo surgery, you get a lot of drugs so that you are unconscious. Here you can see the brain doesn't track the external stimuli. So the brain doesn't align anymore. Yeah, the brain's adaptive power is lost when we lose consciousness. It cannot use its own waves anymore to really adapt to the waves in its environment. And this adaptive power is really critical for consciousness. Yeah. So they no longer react, there's no longer alignment when you lose your consciousness. So, and you can measure this, it's called temporal spatial alignment or entrainment. You can measure that in very fast waves, in very slow waves. Yeah. And that, when you then put that together in your perception, it gives you something like that. So you have a kayak guy, so he's moving, so you need fast waves to track this guy. Yeah, because he's paddling very fast, so you need fast waves in your brain to track him down. Now, the river is also flowing, yeah, but it's not as fast flowing as the kayak guy. Yeah, so meaning you need slightly slower time scales or less faster waves to track this one. And now this one is very stable, very permanent, so you need very long waves, stable waves. So in your brain, the more inner different kinds of waves and speeds and time scales the brain has, the better it can track down in the environment. And then you see it puts it together. As I see, you probably perceive me new. You see, sometimes I move my head, sometimes I move my finger, my arm, and your brain probably tracks all the temporal signatures of this and then puts it together. How exactly the brain takes all these temporal cues and puts the content, meaning Nordhoff with fingers, arms, face, desperately trying to convey the message together, that is not fully clear. But it's clear if this temporal tracking is lacking, you will not have consciousness and you will not have a perception. What is it like to perceive this kayak? So, and for instance, here I show you then on the psychological level, how do you perceive such an alignment? That you probably have a perception of synchrony. You feel in sync with your environment. For instance, when you listen to music, you listen to the, you perceive, you feel, you unconsciously probably tap the rhythm of the music. Yeah, and you cannot control. And the better you track the rhythm of the music with your, let's say, tapping with your finger or with your feet, the more you feel the groove of the music. Yeah, it's a synchrony. So here we tested a large-scale psychological study where we asked subjects of how much they feel synchrony with themselves, with with nature, and with their own body. And we did this before and after COVID. So before COVID, they felt a much higher degree of synchrony with their own self, pure subjective experience, with the other, the nature and the body. Because of course the whole isolation during COVID. And we also saw that people with higher levels of anxiety or depression felt less synchrony with themselves, with the other, with the nature and body. So this is basically the psychological correlate, the experience of synchrony, of what on the neuronal level is sort of an alignment, which is key for your consciousness. I skipped this one. So what is the conclusion of that? And this is important. So your consciousness is intrinsically temporal, and cannot be located in the brain or the environment or the body. It's the connection, the temporal connection between them, which is absolutely key. Yeah. And that is a primarily temporal connection through different time scales, duration, different waves, bigger waves, slower waves, faster waves. Yeah. And again, you already know me as the example of the seaside. So meaning the consciousness cannot be located in the brain or in what particular time scale or in just in one wave, but it's really how the different waves of the brain, the body, and the environment relate to each other. And the better they relate or align to each other, the more likely that you can become consciousness. So ultimately, I would say what I said down here, the localization problem basically transforms into what I would call an alignment problem. How can the brain align its own inner dynamic to the outer dynamics in the world and also in the body? So, and this has key implications for AI. Because I would argue that current artificial agents, they can perform a lot of cognitive tasks. They're fantastic. They're better than humans in many of the tasks, but they lack the inner. They don't have the inner waves, spontaneous inner waves. That's what the brain has with different time scales. So here, I show you on the left. When you listen to, so what the brain has an abundance of different time scales. Time scales mean different durations. Shorter waves, bigger waves, longer waves, short, intermediate, very short, ultra short, very long waves, all kinds of waves. That's what you have to imagine again, seaside. Yeah. Now, when you listen, for instance, to music, particular classical music, classical Western music, has many different time scales. Yeah, they're very intricately elaborated into each other. And the more time scales your brain has, the better it can pick up the music. So now I give you an example. If your robot has only faster time scales, yeah, only the short waves, but not the longer waves, it will always dance to the music too fast. Now, if your music has only the longer time scale, short, here the red ones, it will always dance too slow to the music. So this is why you need an abundance of time scales to properly get the rhythm of the music. So in the current artificial intelligence, they can perform a lot of tasks, external tasks. They're very good in that. But as far as I would say, they lack the inner, the spontaneous, the variety of different time scales in the brain, which are probably evolutionary shape. And that means that the current robots can really actively, and the emphasis is on actively, align to the world. They will not really actively follow those rhythms, and they will not have this kind of perception across multiple time scales. So the emphasis here is on active temporal alignment of the robot. Okay, so that was the first problem. So the location problem, which turns into an alignment problem. Consciousness is relational rather than can be located somewhere. And that relation is a temporal relation, temporal alignment. That is probably still one distinctive criteria. Note that I do not say that I principally exclude that AI can have consciousness, but I only say for now it cannot have consciousness. So now I come to another feature, conscious contents. Already said that conscious contents are usually considered non-physical and mental, and that is the hard problem. Why and how are their mental states? And where does this come from? Because we cannot really observe conscious contents in third-person perspective. It's a subjective, a first-person experience. I cannot see you. I can see your gesture, but I cannot see or measure your feeling of boredom. Yeah, your subjective experience, your consciousness. So that's why in the Western tradition, there's a lot of distinction between first and third-person perspective. And then, of course, the mental has also been related. It is not spatial or temporal. It's beyond spatial and temporal. However, this is not true. So here I show you two Western philosophers, psychologists, beginning of the 20th century, Edmund Husserl, William James, and both said that consciousness has an inherent temporality. It's like a stream of consciousness, William James. Yeah. And that, again, now compared to river, is a continuous river. And now imagine you have different, let's say there's a little storm, some rocks and some trees falling into the river. That's basically like the contents of consciousness. But they really strongly shaped by the underlying stream of the river, by the flow of the river, which if it's very steep, can be very fast, if it's a very broad. So there were many, many, many factors which determine the stream of consciousness. So there is an inherent in our experience, and you probably know this when you think about something and suddenly the thought disappears. Yeah, these fleeting thoughts, for me as a researcher, is a nightmare. I think I have a thought, I have a good idea, and the idea is away. Yeah, because it's an ongoing stream, it's the content is embedded in an ongoing stream. So there's a temporality and also a spatiality as hallmarks of our experience, consciousness. So, and that is further supported because you may know that I'm also a psychiatrist. So I'm dealing with people who suffer really from anxiety or depression or schizophrenia. And indeed, these people do not only just experience anxiety, they also experience a lot of time and space changes. For instance, in anxiety, people have the feeling that their thoughts are racing like crazy. They're really on autopilot. It's very fast. Yeah. And they cannot control it. And if you cannot control something because it's so fast, of course you get anxious. Yeah. Same in schizophrenia, it looks like that suddenly they have sudden gaps in their experience. They call it temporal fragmentation. Yeah. So suddenly imagine that in the ongoing river, you get big stones in there and it blocks the water. That's exactly seems to happen in schizophrenia. So we are even that far now that we use some of these time-space experience changes as marker for differential diagnostic of schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, and stress, post-traumatic stress disorder. So again, where does this mean that conscious contents are shaped by their underlying spatial temporality? And then, of course, where does this come from? That, of course, leads us to the brain. And now I'll show you a couple of studies about thoughts. So, of course, you know what thoughts are, and thoughts, of course, for many philosophers are a paradigmatic example of the mental. However, you have, even in thoughts, you have a certain dynamic. So here we conducted an experiment where we looked for thoughts. We asked subjects, is your thought content more internal, more about your own self, or more external about the environment? And then we also ask for the degree of awareness. So how aware are you? So how intense are those thoughts? And what we could find, so here you could see, and then we measured that in healthy subject and in very depressed subject. And when you have a serious depressed subject in front of you, they often tell you nothing moves. Everything is too slow. They also don't move. You can already sit there. They sit there in the corner, can't move. The facial muscle doesn't move. You call it psychomotor retardation, a typical sign. And here we could show that also the thoughts don't change. They have much less. Here you see the changes between internal and external thoughts. Yeah, there are sometimes the healthy subjects think about themselves and they think about the external environment, and it fluctuates, goes back and forth. But here you see in depression, it's flat. So you have to imagine probably the depression, that's the way I imagine, and I often ask my patients whether they agree, and they usually agree with that. It's like a flat sea where nothing moves. Now imagine, you look at a flat sea. The first 10 minutes, you might find this relieving, relaxing, and it calms you down. Now imagine you look for the next 10 hours at the flat sea. You become crazy, you become depressed. That's exactly what happens in the brain of these patients. So you see again, time plays a key role. Here, through some very elegant measurement, we can also basically construct a power spectrum of the thoughts through the time series of thoughts, also the frequency. And we can see that in the depression, they literally have decreased power in their thought changes. And that's exactly what they experience. Less energy. I don't feel any power, no energy. I'm drained. The seriously depressed patient. Same for the frequency. We could see here, literally measure the frequency like a power spectrum with the engineers who helped us here. Yeah, you can really measure the frequency. They're much slower in their thought change. They don't change their thought, as you could already see here. Yeah, and that's exactly what they experience. It's always the same thought. Yeah, we call it clinically rumination. That's why we spoke in the title of the paper, Slow and Powerless Thought Dynamics in Depression. So that already suggests maybe there's a strong temporal shaping of our thoughts. Because if your background river is too slow, the contents of your river / the thought content also don't change. Yeah? So here, it's another very clever investigation by one of my PhD students from China, Jingyu Hua, who called for me to be in time for the talk today or too late. So he investigated when you focus your thoughts, when you focus on the task, there's on thoughts, or when you're distracted, you think about something else. Like when you really listen to me, your thoughts are completely here on with my topic, but maybe now you think already, okay, about the lunch. Hopefully the talk is over soon and we can have some nice Chinese lunch. Yeah, so then basically you have what is called off thoughts. Yeah, and I spare you the details. So he could really track the on thoughts, so the thoughts focus on the task, and the off thoughts that are not focused on the task. He could really track them down in the brain activity that the on thoughts, which are focused on the task, were faster. You can see here the brown line / the alpha frequency, whereas the off thoughts are much slower here in the theta line. So meaning your off and on thoughts, maybe you focus on the task or not in your thoughts, have a temporal shaping, meaning faster or slower frequencies in your brain. Yeah, and that makes sense. When you're more off, when you don't really listen to my talk, you're probably in a slower mode in your brain activity than when you were listening to my talk, and you're in a faster mode. And that makes sense that your internal and external thoughts are more distinguished by the timing, because you need to be fast in order to follow the external environment and my speech and my movement. You don't need to track the external speed when you have your own internal thought. You can be a little bit slow. So here, interestingly also, this is another student of mine, Bianca Ventura, who did this in meditation, that you have different meditation induction techniques, and you have different number of thought contents. For instance, here in the Vipassana meditation, you focus continuously on different bodily objects. You focus on your hand, on your shoulder, on your breast, on your legs, on your feet, on your heart, and so on and so forth. And you scan them separately. So your attention is focused on certain object, and you can see this here sequentially. However, in the Shunya meditation, you have no object. You just try to let the objects pass by, so your thoughts have no particular focus. So now here you would argue that here I need short time scale, short duration, because I need to capture this, then this, then this, and this. But here I have a broader range. So now, how can we measure the brain timescales, for instance, what is called a temporal window, autocorrelation window? And you can see that that window is much wider in the Shunya meditation, where you have a lot of thought contents. But when you have specific thought contents, your temporal window must be shorter to separate those thought contents from the other thought content. So literally, you can, through the psychological induction and the neuronal measures, this was done in EEG, you can measure the temporal windows of thoughts, the durations of your thoughts. Yeah, and here you see that your thoughts have a strong temporal shaping. Yeah, and we have more studies on that. So meaning that even your contents, your mental contents, your contents of your consciousness are strongly temporally shaped. So they're more dynamically shaped than mental. That's why we speak of a temporal spatial theory of consciousness, TTC, various papers. So now, conclusion of this section, mental contents are not mental, but they're primarily dynamic. They're temporal, yeah, rather than physical and being mental. So maybe the heart problem might better be transformed into a dynamic problem. How can dynamic shape conscious content? So now, how about AI? So as far as I know, please correct me if I'm wrong, if we want to have thought content, or if we want to meditate, we need inner thoughts. And if these inner thoughts are strongly related, and we have more lines of evidence, by the brain's inner waves, its timescales. Now, if you do not have inner timescales, I would argue you do not have inner conscious content nor thoughts. So the AI is ultimately probably mainly driven by input-output relationship. So I would argue at this point, AI cannot meditate at this point in time, as there's no inner dynamics or topography that can be organized or reorganized in the sense of a meditation scale. Meaning it doesn't really have conscious context, because for me, AI lacks these multiple time scales. Now, I come to the third. I try to make it short. The existence of consciousness in the natural world. So we always have assumed, particularly in the Western world, that consciousness and the mind are special. So this René Descartes, philosopher in Europe in the 15th, 16th century. So he basically said, okay, we can observe the brain, we can observe the body in third-person perspective, but we cannot observe the mind in third-person perspective. We can only experience it. Therefore, the mind is special as distinguished from body and brain and the physical world, which are non-special. This leads us to the classical mind-body problem. So then, of course, we say, nowadays we say, yes, okay, there is no mind anymore, but there's a brain. But the assumption of specialness is preserved. We say, there must be something special in the brain itself that mediates consciousness. And that special is often addressed in the neuroscientific theories of consciousness. For instance, in the integrated information theory, you see, okay, it's a particular integration of information that is key for consciousness and distinct from all the rest of the brain that remains known. Global neuronal workspace. Okay, the activity in the brain spreads throughout the whole brain, through the prefrontal cortex, and that is special to consciousness and different from the rest of the brain. And I could go on. So what basically say, there's a principal difference between the conscious brain and the rest of the brain. Special versus non-special. That's an assumption of something as special. That reminds you, of course, something. When you go into the history of science, it reminds you of, for instance, that the Earth has also been considered as special. The position of the Earth was considered before Copernicus at the center of the universe. Yeah. Then Copernicus said, no, it's not special at all. This is one planet, another, among others, which also moves around us. Darwin. Before Darwin, oh, human is special, has a special connection to God and different from all other biological species. We're just part of the ongoing evolution and have been evolved, and our predecessors and so on. So nothing is special. So here in both cases, the Earth and the human species turn out to be non-special. Same here. We still have the assumption of specialness. Now you can consider this as maybe what is similar between the rest of the brain and consciousness. maybe they share. And that similarity again leads me to look into nature. You already saw I tried to invoke examples of nature. Here's the seismic earth waves, here's the sea waves, and this is a beautiful quote by Nikola Tesla. If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, vibration. I could say exactly the same. If you want to find the secrets of consciousness, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. And you see, that's the way I consider the brain. So then suddenly, the brain is nothing special. It's just a bunch of time scales. Look here in the evolution, geologic time scales are obviously much longer than the time scales of the brain, but it's ultimately time scales. Yeah. What are time scales? Time scales are the duration of a process. For instance, your heartbeat has a 1 second time scale. Yeah. That's the time scale of the heartbeat. However, the time scale of a day is much longer. It's 24 hours. Yeah. The time scale of a year, I don't need to tell you, is 365 days, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So the brain has a variety of different time scales, and we haven't really fully understood that. Yeah, but it's clear the brain has its own inner time scale, it has its own inner clocks. It has not only one clock, it has multiple clocks. It's amazing. Yeah, and it uses these time scales to adapt to the time scales in the environment. Yeah, so, and that's what I'm saying. There is no principal difference between the brain's time scales and the other time scales. It's only the range of time scales, they're longer or shorter. But there's a certain overlap of the time scales. Yeah, different durations, but they all show time series of their changes, fluctuations. So, and why are these time scales so important for consciousness? So this is a schematic figure, but which is strongly driven by empirical data, and I walk you through, because this is important to understand the notion of time scales again for consciousness. So now imagine, so you have this scene. You have a thief who, a bank thief who robbed a lot of money and is walking away, is running away, and the police comes after him. Now the police says, please stop, you won't catch me, you will not. So this scene has multiple time scales. You need to understand here the running guy. You need to understand this one. You need to have the time scale of each of these words, but you also need longer time scales to put them all together. So you need an abundance of different time scales to capture the scene, to capture, remember the kayak guy, which I showed earlier. You have an abundance of time scales here in the environment your brain can capture and can basically align with. Now, if your temporal windows, your time scales in the brain become longer, and the shorter time scales disappear, as it happens, for instance, when you become drowsy and fall to sleep, your time scales, this is data driven, become longer. As in sleep here, I showed you in one sleep drowsiness, you lose the shorter time scales, and look, your speech, the perception of your speech changes also becomes a little bit more blurry. Yeah, you don't perceive it as dynamic anymore, it becomes a little blurry. Now you lose even more time scale in, let's say, in a deeper sleep stage, and when you're sedated, then it becomes even more blurry and you lose it. And now you're completely unconscious. Nothing goes anymore. This is, again, as I said, data-driven, deep anesthesia, or when you're in coma, you don't perceive anything because everything is the same. You cannot separate. Everything is just one big pie, completely unspecific, non-differentiated. So this is schematic, but it's exactly the data-driven. So your time scales are extremely important for your consciousness to match with corresponding time scale in your environmental context. So I often say that basically the brain intrinsic activity provides different durations. It's like different temporal window sizes. So look here, it's a purple. You see the same. You see a the same tree in a much more fine-grained resolution, but you don't see it that this is a whole tree. Where you're just seeing this, you wouldn't know what it is. Yeah, it's a branch, but is it a flower? Is it a tree? We have no idea, let alone the landscape in which it's situated. So you see, and these different time scales, exactly like I also showed here before, let you perceive the different times, corresponding time scale in your environmental context, and by that you have a perception / ultimately a consciousness. So again, I already showed that quote, but what I want to point out here, it seems that environment, neuronal states, and mental states share their time scales. Yeah. So you have if you have corresponding time scales between your brain and your environment, you can have a mental state / a conscious state, and with corresponding spatial and temporal features. This is what we call co-occurrency, which is really a model. And we have another paper in the pipeline for that, to develop that more, and various investigations, that you have really shared time scales between the context and the content from the environment, between the context of your perception and your brain activity. For instance, look and you have a discrepancy when your brain becomes too slow, like in depression, then the brain cannot pick up the faster stimuli. So you always feel in your consciousness too slow. That's what happens in depression. So meaning what is shared between brain and world, shared timescales of brain and world. And that also shares it with consciousness. So that's what we call currency. So now this has huge implications for AI. Because here, as of now, current AI does not have intrinsic timescale. However, we indeed now try to develop neural networks where we try to build in timescales. Why do we do that? We are not interested in making them conscious. We are interested in building timescales into the network in order to get better prediction of our data, for instance. Yeah, because then if you have changes in the brain's timescales, as we see them in depression or schizophrenia or anxiety, then you need machine learning or a network algorithm which has corresponding timescales in itself to predict the changes in the timescales in the data set you want to predict. So they do not share the timescale. They do not, as far as I would say, have no common currency of world robot. So I try to illustrate it in a different way, and then I come to the end of my talk. So we speak of this. So throughout the talk, you saw that mental features like thought, like consciousness, sense of self, psychotic disorder, have a strong spatial temporal shaping in their experience and their consciousness. So this is what we call spatial temporal neuroscience. So you have a deeper layer in your brain, which is the brain dynamic, and that shapes your mental features. So you can look on our website, we have various lines of investigation, that there's a strong spatial and temporal and also spatial topographic shaping of your mental states, like consciousness, like self, mind wandering, thoughts. We also investigate meditation and various psychotic disorder. So, and that in turn provides also a spatial temporal envelope to your higher order cognitive functions like affective functions, emotions, cognition, attention, working memory. Again, you can look at some paper on our website, to your perception, to your movement, and also to social neuroscience. So meaning brain dynamics drives brain function. And that's what we call spatial temporal neuroscience. Is a textbook which I brought out this year. Now, in the current AI, they're really good in this one, but they're not good in this. They're lacking the dynamics. And that's why I would say it looks like this. Yeah. They can perform the cognitive more and more better, also the affective, sensory, motor function, but do not experience. There's no subjective experience. Why? There's no what it is like, because they lack the dynamics. So with that, I come close to the end. So I would argue that artificial agents do not yet show consciousness. So here, I do not rule it out. In principle, I just not, for the moment, we haven't properly understood the brain, that they're not intrinsically temporal or ecological. So why consciousness? What is consciousness? It's about a point of view. You experience yourself as part of a wider world. Remember the alignment. Through the alignment, you do not have consciousness in your brain. Your consciousness is you integrate yourself as part of the wider world as well. So you have a point of view, we speak here in this paper of ecological background layer, which sort of situates you. And that's, of course, a continuous spatial-temporal relation. For instance, many musicians tell you, when you listen to music, the professional musician, or when the performers, they become part of the music. So they're completely here, or in meditative state, extreme meditative state. You become part of your environment. There's a unity. They speak of non-dual awareness. You don't experience a split between yourself and the world anymore, but you're completely immersed and embedded in your experience in the world. So your point of view is here, and your mental is basically shifted all to here. And that, I would argue, that point of view, which is, of course, intrinsically the spatial-temporal matching, the alignment is lacking in kernel AI. That's why I would argue they have no point of view at this point in time, and they lack consciousness, no experience of own self and body as part of the world as a whole. And with that, I come to the end. I hope I could at least put the idea across that I think in our current approach to consciousness, we have some real mistakes in there. It's not located somewhere. It's rather a continuous relational or continuous alignment. It is not mental. The contents are not mental. They're maybe much more dynamic. And it is not special at all, because it's a basic dynamic features which we as humans and our brain share and overlap with the rest of the world, as well as with other species. And that these three errors also contain major implications for how to evaluate whether AI has consciousness or not. And with that, I'm closing. And if you want more information, you can mail me or look on our website. Thank you very much.
Hello, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, and thanks very much for your talk. And it's too late for you now, so we cancel the Q&A section, and you can just leave the meeting now. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.今天上午就结束了，大家可以先去吃饭。
Hello, Professor Nossel. Thank you for this wonderful lecture. You have really wonderfully turned the mind-body problem to the world brain problem. Also, the localization problem to the alignment problem. I'm really very impressed with this approach. But I have some sort of a conundrum to ask you in this context. If the future AI makes it much easier to align with the world, in other words, through their deep layers and the evolving dynamics, do you think that AI in the future will become more conscious, or will have components of consciousness as we humans do? And that's a real possibility, because the current AI doesn't directly interface with the world, but new types of AI, such as GPT-4.0 or 4.0, is already directly interacting with the world. And I imagine that if something like that occurs through a humanoid robot, that level of dynamics might be obtained. So I'm just curious of your opinions in this regard. How, now that we have turned the localization problem to the alignment problem, whether we can give future AI a new spin. Thank you very much.
Very good question. So first, I don't think it's principally impossible, and I would say for now, but I'm sure and agreed, I indeed want to use some of these neural networks for instance, for doing brain-computer interface techniques with psychiatric patients, for instance, in depression, to fasten their brain. So definitely yes, in principle, yes. The question is, of course, is the range of timescales. I think you need a certain repertoire of timescales to become conscious. And as far as I understand, unfortunately, there's not many research about the range or repertoire of timescales even across different biological species. In particular, you need an imprinting of the timescales by your evolutionary context. Yeah, so you need a certain fitting procedure, which of course occurs in our case, in the case of humans, has occurred over the whole evolution timescale. And so I would probably say yes, for certain ranges, or that you say partial consciousness, yes. I give you, for instance, one example from S. Bird. So we are very interested also in semantics and semantic dynamics. And part of that, we went into S. Bird, which is a natural language program. And implicit, there are sort of slightly different, it basically gives you the similarity between different, semantic similarity between different sentences, cosine similarity between the different sentences. And it gives you a vector. And when you look into the design of that, there's sort of 3 timescales implicitly hidden in there. Yeah, and I think that's definitely a way, and definitely we can learn from the brain to build some timescales into, let's say, deep learning networks. And last comment on that, you mentioned the different layer in the deep learning, and I completely agree with that. So for me, the brain, we develop a model of brain, what we call a dynamic layer model of brain, which is also in this 2024 textbook quite prominent. And these different dynamic layers have different timescales. So, and I think that's where indeed the deep learning networks are of high interest to us.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor. And it's too late for you now, so today's meeting is over, and you can just leave this meeting.
Okay, thank you. Have a good day. Thank you.
这个各位专家，一会儿我的草原的传染啊，地球式的其他的同学。